The new temp, Liam Miller, stumbled just as Caleb Thorne rounded the corner. A steaming cup of coffee flew from his grasp, splashing across the chest of Caleb's custom-tailored suit. The dark stains spread instantly over the fine Italian wool, a chaotic blemish on a meticulously crafted image. The lobby, a cathedral of polished marble and cool glass, seemed to hold its breath. Caleb's expression didn't change, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. That suit had been a gift from Julian, custom-fitted for their 3rd anniversary. He'd planned to wear it to their celebration dinner tonight, a silent testament to the precision and care he valued in all things, especially his relationship. Now it was ruined. He thought that Liam must be incompetent and decided he should report to human resources, collect his final check, and be gone. Caleb didn't bother to look at the young man's face, his attention caught by a faint, shimmering text that materialized in his peripheral vision, words of glowing cyan that only he could see. He immediately called his assistant, his tone clipped and devoid of emotion, instructing him to have the jacket sent to the premier dry cleaner in the city. Liam remained rooted to the spot, his voice a tremor in the cavernous silence when he addressed Caleb. Caleb's brow furrowed as he finally looked at him, his gaze impatient. He asked why Liam was still there, his voice low with the implication that he might have security escort him out. Before the threat could fully form, Liam was at his side, his posture one of complete desperation. He begged for another chance, insisting it was an accident. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Caleb's sleeve. The touch was hesitant, his voice hoarse and thick with unshed tears. For a split second, an unfamiliar impulse flickered through Caleb, a strange urge to let the man stay. But instinct took over, and he pulled his arm back sharply. Liam stumbled but caught his balance, moving closer again, his demeanor so utterly submissive it turned Caleb's stomach. Caleb Thorne despised nothing more than people who trampled on their own dignity. A surge of irritation rose within him, hot and sharp. But then Liam did something unexpected. He closed the small distance between them, his arms wrapping around Caleb's waist in a desperate, clinging embrace. He confessed tearfully that he couldn't lose this job. The raw despair in the gesture cut through Caleb's annoyance, replaced by a disconcerting pang of sympathy. But the shimmering text scrolling wildly at the edge of his vision distracted him, its messages now more intrusive, more demanding. He frowned, his displeasure mounting as he worked to pry the younger man's arms from his waist. The moment he broke the contact, a sharp, acidic scent drilled into his senses, pure key lime, overwhelming and potent. Liam had pulled down the collar of his shirt, exposing the pale skin of his neck and the scent gland pulsing there. He offered it to Caleb, whispering about a term he'd heard used in certain circles, asking if Caleb would accept him. The scent was so concentrated it was almost bitter. Logic screamed at Caleb to push him away, to call security, to end this bizarre and unprofessional encounter. Yet his body felt leaden, rooted to the marble floor. He stared at the exposed gland, and a primal, horrifying thought bloomed in his mind. To bite down, to mark, to claim. The glowing words in his vision declared them a perfect match, a destined pair. Perfect match? Caleb held his breath, shutting his eyes and leaning back so far he almost lost his balance. Anything to create distance. He ordered him to get out, his voice shaking as he fell to one knee. His hand clamped over the back of his own neck where his alpha instincts were raging. Liam could see the struggle etched on Caleb's face and took a hesitant step forward. With every inch Liam closed, Caleb's sense of reality blurred. For a disorienting moment, the face before him morphed into that of his fiancé, Julian. He warned him not to come any closer, his hand finding the base of a heavy floral arrangement on a nearby pedestal. He staggered to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the cool night air from a vent finally clearing his head slightly. Liam continued his slow, desperate advance, his expression a strange mix of threat and profound sorrow. Tears streamed down his face as he explained his situation. A sick mother in a hospital, a brother needing tuition money. He felt he had no other choice. Caleb wanted to unleash his own alpha pheromones, to dominate him into submission. But if the floating text was right about their compatibility, it would be like throwing gasoline on a fire. He stopped him with a single word, the command sharp and final. He told him he wouldn't be fired. He would have HR find a more suitable position for him, a role where he wouldn't have to compromise his dignity. Liam froze, the intense key lime scent receding as he straightened up, bowing his head repeatedly in gratitude. Caleb nodded curtly, adding a stern that he was engaged and a situation like this could never happen again, or the consequences would be severe. The holographic text flickered, mocking his resolve. The shower did little to help. No matter how many times he scrubbed his skin raw, Caleb could still smell the cloying sweetness of key lime clinging to him. The thought of Julian smelling another omega on him, of Julian thinking he'd been unfaithful, sent a sharp pain through his chest. The persistent, shimmering text floated at the edge of his vision, a swarm of ghostly gnats. With a roar of frustration, he slammed his fist into the frosted glass of the shower door. It shattered, the sound echoing in the steam-filled bathroom as shards and blood sprayed across the white tile. The doorbell chimed, a shrill interruption. Wrapping a towel around his waist, he hurried to the door. Through the peephole, he saw Ryan Vance, Julian's older brother and his own childhood best friend. He opened the door. Ryan started talking before he was even fully inside, demanding to know why Caleb hadn't answered any of his 50 frantic texts. Caleb tried to project an aura of calm, asking what was wrong. Ryan's tirade stopped short when he saw Caleb's hand, bloodied and wrapped haphazardly in a towel. Ryan pointed at the injury, asking what the hell had happened. Caleb muttered something about an accident as he retrieved a first aid kit, beginning to wrap his knuckles properly with gauze. He deflected, pushing Ryan to explain his panic, a cold dread creeping into his heart. He asked if something had happened to Julian. Ryan's frantic energy returned. He told Caleb he was right, that Julian, who had always been the most level-headed of them all, had gotten into a fight at the university. He hadn't told their parents yet, coming straight to Caleb instead. Caleb's jaw tightened. He rose and began to dress with swift, economical movements. Ever since that strange text had first appeared, a sense of impending doom had settled over him. A fight was just a fight, he told himself, trying to quell the rising panic. He and Ryan left the penthouse and headed for the campus. Walking into the dean's office, Caleb almost didn't recognize his fiancé. Just yesterday morning, they had video chatted, and Julian had been his usual self. Elegant, composed, his dark hair perfectly styled. The young man standing before him now was a stranger. His hair was a shocking, artificial crimson, and he was dressed in ripped jeans and a leather jacket. When he turned, Caleb saw the glint of multiple piercings in his lip. The collar of his shirt was open, revealing the edge of a dark tattoo on his collarbone. The polished air was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he belonged in a back-alley punk club. Ryan groaned beside him, unable to look. Caleb walked over to Julian, standing beside him, his voice low as he asked why he'd fought. Julian scoffed, giving him a dismissive once-over, and muttered that he just didn't like the other guy's face. Caleb reached up to touch his hair, an instinctive gesture of comfort, but Julian slapped his hand away. The glowing text flared in Caleb's vision, cruel and triumphant. He lowered his hand, his fist clenching at his side. This wasn't Julian. He couldn't hate him. The script, whatever it was doing this to his love. The dean returned, followed by a boy with a freshly bandaged head. Caleb realized then the other boy's injuries were significant. Julian had always been slight. He must have had help. He asked where the boy's parents were, stating that he would cover all medical expenses and offer 10 times that for damages. After a moment of hesitation from the dean, the door opened again and Liam Miller rushed in, pulling the injured boy into a fierce hug. He fussed over his brother, Leo, asking if he was okay. Caleb massaged his temples. Of all the people for Julian to have fought, it had to be Liam Miller's brother. Ryan, losing his patience, grabbed Julian's arm and told him to apologize. Julian made a sound of disgust and refused to budge. A protective instinct flared in Caleb, and he pulled Julian away from Ryan, shielding him with his own body. He addressed Liam directly, apologizing on Julian's behalf. Liam, after wiping his eyes, stood up and waved his hands, insisting it was all right and that he didn't blame Julian. Caleb felt a sliver of relief, but it was short-lived. Julian wrenched himself free from Caleb's hold, yelling that he hadn't needed anyone to apologize for him because he'd done nothing wrong. He tugged at his collar and Caleb saw the tattoo more clearly now. It looked like a name, a set of initials. Before he could get a better look, Julian turned and fled the office. Ryan started to follow, but Caleb stopped him, telling him to handle the aftermath while he went after Julian. By the time Caleb got outside, Julian was already climbing into a taxi. Without a second thought, Caleb got into his own car and followed. The cyan text scrolled across his windshield, taunting him. He watched the taxi snake through traffic until it entered a dilapidated neighborhood and pulled up in front of a grimy brick tenement building. His heart hammered against his ribs. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, swerving his car to block the taxi's path. He got out and stood in front of Julian. He told him to get in the car, that they were going home. Julian paused, his expression one of pure annoyance, and tried to walk around him. Caleb moved faster, blocking his path again. He repeated his demand to go home, a raw ache spreading through his chest. Julian just laughed, a bitter, unfamiliar sound. He shook his head, his eyes glaring at Caleb as he sneered that they were just in a business arrangement and that Caleb should stop acting like his husband. Caleb's hand shot out, his fingers closing around Julian's wrist. He asked what was wrong, begging him to snap out of it. Julian ripped his arm away, shrugging with an indifference that cut Caleb to the core. He claimed nothing was wrong, that he had found his true love, and they should just stay out of each other's way after the wedding. True love. Caleb repeated the words, his throat tight. He asked how long Julian had known this person, how much he could possibly know about him. Julian's reply was brazen, that he'd met him at a dive bar the previous night. He spoke of the man with a dreamy look in his eyes, a look he used to reserve only for Caleb. He gushed about how wonderful this new man was, how he was a great fighter, so much better than a stiff like Caleb. Looking at Julian's shining eyes, Caleb felt a wave of surreal horror. This wasn't the man he knew. The script had him. He grabbed Julian's wrist again, pulling him close. He demanded to know how Julian could fall in love in a single day when they had grown up together. The sky opened up then, a sudden downpour soaking them both in seconds. The rain seemed to cool his anger, but seeing Julian's uncaring expression made his heart feel like it was splitting in two. His arms locked around Julian's waist as he lowered his head, his voice breaking as he pleaded with him not to be controlled by the plot, to wake up. Julian struggled, shouting for Caleb to let him go before swinging a hand and slapping him hard across the face. The sting was sharp, but Caleb barely registered it. He grabbed Julian's hand again, his voice raw with desperation. He asked if his feelings for this stranger were truly deeper than the 20 years they had shared. Julian tore his hand free, his eyes full of disgust. He said it was different, that Caleb couldn't compare. The rain blurred Caleb's vision. He looked at the stranger before him, the man he loved but couldn't reach, and felt himself break. His knees gave out, and he sank to the wet pavement, still clinging to Julian. He begged him to wake up. Julian fought back, his fists hammering against Caleb's back. The pain was nothing compared to the agony of having his love right in front of him, yet so utterly lost. He heard Julian call him disgusting. Just as Caleb's grip was about to fail, Julian's struggles ceased. His hands froze in mid-air. After a few seconds of silence, he heard a confused whisper. Julian asked where he was. Then his voice filled with alarm as he asked Caleb why he was kneeling. A surge of hope shot through Caleb. He looked up, scrambling to his feet and pulling Julian into a fierce, protective embrace. His voice choked with emotion as he said his name, relieved that he was finally back. The text in his vision flickered erratically. He held on tightly, terrified that, as the text suggested, Julian would forget him again. Soon, a violent tremor ran through Julian's body. Caleb opened his car door and lifted him inside. Julian tried to speak, but no sound came out. A rough voice called out from the alley. A man with bleached blonde hair sneered at them, asking Julian why he was with this other man when he'd promised to be done with him. Julian's face was streaked with tears as he managed to choke out 2 words. "Save me." Then, in an instant, his eyes changed again, becoming hard and defiant. He shoved Caleb away, telling him to get lost, that his boyfriend was calling him. He scrambled out of the car and ran toward the man waiting by the tenement stairs, throwing himself into his arms. The rain fell harder. Caleb stood alone, watching the scene, a feeling like his heart was being torn from his chest. He clenched his fists, meeting the other man's challenging gaze. He would not leave his Omega with another man. He would save him from this damned script. He used his connections to get Julian home. The moment the penthouse door closed, Julian became a feral thing, grabbing the front of Caleb's shirt, his eyes blazing. He demanded to know what Caleb had done with his boyfriend. His breath, laced with the scent of gardenias, washed over Caleb's neck. Caleb let him hold his grip, his gaze fixed on Julian's beautiful, furious eyes. He found that he still loved him, even when he had become the very thing he'd always despised. He gently covered Julian's hands with his own, his voice even. He explained that his men hadn't even had to touch the man. A small amount of money had been enough to make him disappear. Julian reeled back as if struck, his voice rising as he insisted it wasn't possible, that the man had professed his love. Caleb stepped forward, closing the distance and pulling Julian into an embrace. Julian struggled for a moment, but his resistance was weak. Caleb's hand moved up to cup the back of his neck, his lips close to Julian's ear as he murmured that someone who truly loved him wouldn't leave for a pittance. Julian's struggles stopped completely. He went limp, sinking onto the nearby sofa. The faint scent of gardenias began to thicken in the air, a sweet, intoxicating perfume that signaled the onset of his heat. Caleb felt a wave of profound relief that he had gotten him back in time. The thought of Julian spending his heat with that lowlife would have driven him mad. Julian curled up on the sofa, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. He whispered that the man had promised to be with him. Caleb sat beside him, releasing a small amount of his own calming mint-scented pheromones. He gently drew Julian into his arms. This time, there was no fight. Julian melted against him. Caleb promised to stay with him, his voice low and soothing as he pressed a kiss to Julian's forehead, just as he had done countless times before. He released more of his scent, letting it intertwine with the gardenia until Julian's body finally relaxed. Tilting Julian's head to the side, he gently took hold of his scent gland between his teeth. Julian let out a soft gasp as Caleb bit down, injecting his own alpha pheromones, a possessive but tender wave of mint that enveloped the gardenia scent. A familiar sense of rightness settled over him. He felt Julian's body tremble, and then warm tears fell onto the back of his hand. Julian murmured, asking why he felt so sad. Caleb tightened his embrace, resting his chin on Julian's shoulder, his heart aching. He told him it was because his body was more honest than his mind. It was telling him that he was still in love. He stayed with Julian through the entire heat, which lasted longer than usual, perhaps because of the rain he'd been caught in. A low fever clung to him for days, but this morning, it had finally broken. Caleb brushed his thumb over Julian's cheek. His eyelashes fluttered, and he snuggled deeper into Caleb's arms, still sound asleep. But Caleb knew that as long as the holographic text persisted, Julian would never be truly free. He kissed the tip of his ear. The vibration of his phone on the nightstand broke the quiet. He remembered it was the final day to sign a major contract. His business partner was likely getting impatient. He promised to be back soon and told Julian to wait for him. After dressing, he went downstairs where the housekeeper, Maria, was setting out breakfast. He told her to look after Julian and not to let him leave under any circumstances, to call him if anything happened. He drove to the office. During Julian's heat, the shimmering text had been blessedly absent, displaying only a no-signal message. But the closer he got to his downtown office, the more it flickered back to life. He ignored it. The elevator opened directly into his executive suite, and his assistant rushed to meet him. Their potential partner, Mr. Henderson, was on his third visit and was not pleased. Caleb nodded, straightened his suit jacket, and walked toward the conference room. As he rounded a corner near the stairwell, he heard a crude, wheezing voice. It was Brock Henderson, the man he was supposed to meet, and he had Liam Miller cornered in the shadows of the stairwell. Henderson was telling him not to act so innocent, reminding him of his time working in a bar. Liam told him to let go, his voice strained. He said he'd quit that job and that Henderson was going too far. Caleb paused, his feet silent on the plush carpet. The holographic text flared to life, filling his vision. Henderson sneered, his hand reaching for Liam's face, reminding him that he was the one who paid his mother's medical bills. As Henderson's hand closed around Liam's throat, tearing at his collar, there was a loud thud. Liam had smashed a heavy binder against the side of Henderson's head and used the moment of shock to break free. He stumbled out of the stairwell and froze when he saw Caleb. His head bowed as he murmured Caleb's name before quickly moving to stand behind him. The holographic text went wild with commentary on Caleb's inaction. Henderson emerged from the stairwell, clutching his head, his face contorted in a mask of rage. He stopped dead when he saw Caleb, his expression shifting from fury to horror. Caleb's gaze was glacial as it swept over him. He stated coolly that for Henderson to accost one of his employees in his building right in front of him was a profound miscalculation. Henderson sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at Liam, claiming he was a fraud who had lied his way into the company and was nothing but trash. Liam cried out that it wasn't true. Caleb had his assistant escort Liam away. He then informed Henderson that Liam's character was irrelevant, but his own was not. He stated that had he known the kind of man Henderson was, he never would have been allowed through the front door. The deal was off. Henderson stared in disbelief, asking if Caleb was really throwing away such an important contract over him. Caleb ignored him and called security, reporting a trespasser causing a disturbance. Henderson's face cycled through shades of red and purple. He shot one last venomous look in the direction Liam had gone and allowed himself to be escorted out. The hallway was quiet again. Caleb called Ryan to handle the legal fallout from the broken deal, then prepared to head home. As he passed the break room, Liam stood up and bowed his head deeply, thanking him. Caleb simply nodded. He told Liam that his past didn't concern him, but at his company, advancement was based on merit, and he looked forward to seeing him succeed. Liam bowed again. Caleb turned and left. Sitting in his car, he lit a cigarette. The text in his vision had changed. It spoke of how both Liam and Caleb were different now, as if they were coming alive. He thought that maybe soon his Julian would come back too. He extinguished the cigarette just as his phone rang. It was Maria, her voice frantic and choked with fear. She stammered that Julian had woken up, seen that his tattoo was gone, and was now trying to carve it back onto his neck with a knife. Caleb's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. He floored it. The tattoo was the blonde man's initials. He had found it repulsive and had a specialist come to the penthouse to remove it while Julian was feverish near the end of his heat. He had asked Julian for permission, and at the time he'd seemed to agree. Why was he losing his mind over it now? The text supplied a cruel answer. Because Julian was the villain, and deviating from the script was a death sentence. Caleb roared at the words floating in the air, yelling that Julian was a good person and he wouldn't let him die. He would save him. The text seemed to quiet, surprised by his outburst. He ran 2 red lights, his mind filled with images of Julian. His gentle smile, the way he'd cling to Caleb's shirt when he was sleeping, his focused expression in the university lab. All these moments coalesced into a single, desperate thought. He could not lose him. He screeched to a halt in front of the house and sprinted upstairs. The living room was in disarray. In the master bathroom, 2 maids were struggling to hold Julian's arm. He held a small paring knife, the tip pointed at his own collarbone. The smooth skin where the tattoo had been was already bleeding from several fresh cuts. Caleb bellowed his name and lunged forward, wrapping his arms around him and wrenching the knife from his hand. Maria took the weapon, her face pale with sweat, and retreated. Caleb held Julian tight, whispering that he was there, that he was home. The fight went out of Julian the moment Caleb touched him. He collapsed against Caleb's chest, his body racked with violent sobs. His tears soaked Caleb's shirt, hot against his skin. He didn't know what was happening. He cried. His mind was a chaotic mess. Caleb enveloped him in his pheromones, stroking his back and repeating that it was okay, that he was safe, that no one could hurt him. His comfort only made Julian cry harder. He confessed that there was a voice in his head, a voice that told him he wasn't the main character, that he was supposed to die. He told Caleb he was in so much pain. Caleb froze. Julian was becoming aware. This could be a good sign. He held Julian's face in his hands, wiping away the tears. He reminded him that they weren't married yet, asking if he would really be so cruel as to leave him all alone. Julian shook his head violently, the tears flowing faster. Caleb gently guided him to the bed. While he cleaned and bandaged the cuts on his collarbone, he asked Maria to remove every sharp object from the room. He sat on the edge of the bed, stroking Julian's hair. Julian's eyes were distant, still lost in the horror of his own actions. Caleb asked him to promise they would fight this together. Julian nodded weakly. Caleb urged him to sleep, to rest his body after the heat. But Julian grabbed his hand, his voice tight with fear, saying he couldn't sleep because the voice wouldn't stop. So Caleb lay down beside him, pulling him into his arms. He suggested they talk about their childhood, about the first time they met. It was at the Van Cess summer home in the Hamptons. Julian was sitting quietly, building a tower of blocks. Caleb, for years older, had walked right up to him, declared him the prettiest person he'd ever seen, and planted a loud kiss on his cheek. The adults had laughed. Julian's face had turned beet red, but he hadn't moved. Their grandfathers had joked that if one turned out to be an alpha and the other an omega, they should arrange a marriage. Caleb had cheered at the idea. That finally got a reaction out of Julian, who smacked him on the head and called him a jerk. Years later, Caleb presented as an alpha. Not long after, Julian presented as an omega. Throughout their teenage years, he and Ryan took Julian everywhere. He went from a shy boy to someone who boldly accepted Caleb's affection. The day Julian was accepted into college, Caleb confessed his love with an armful of flowers. Julian's smile was radiant as he called his name, his voice making Caleb's heart melt. They had kissed amidst the cheers of their friends, promising to be together forever. As he recounted these memories, Julian's tense body began to relax. But Caleb found that his own tears were now silently tracing paths down his temples. Julian suddenly looked up, his hand coming to touch Caleb's cheek. He asked if everyone would be better off if he just died. Caleb cut him off, his tone severe. He told him never to say such a thing. Julian looked at him, his eyes strangely calm, and said he didn't want Caleb to be in pain, didn't want to ruin what was meant to be a beautiful story. Caleb couldn't bear it. He silenced him with a kiss, deep and desperate, until Julian was breathless. He rested his forehead against Julian's, his gaze unwavering as he told him that if he died, then he would too. He said Julian was his life, and there was no meaning without him. Julian stared at him, fresh tears welling in his eyes. This time, however, they were not tears of despair, but of hope. He wrapped his arms around Caleb's neck, burying his face in his chest. His voice was muffled but determined as he promised to try, though he admitted he was scared. Caleb held him tighter, promising to protect him, to fight off anything that tried to change him. He told him they would get married and be together for a lifetime, and nothing could tear them apart. Held in that embrace, Julian finally drifted into a peaceful sleep, murmuring Caleb's name in his dreams. And each time, Caleb would answer, telling him he was there, that he loved him. The holographic text in his vision seemed to shimmer with a new, supportive energy. Perhaps marriage was the answer. The past few days of confinement had been hard on Julian. Caleb decided a change of scenery was in order, and though he hired discreet security to follow them, their stroll through a bustling shopping district felt liberating. As they passed a designer boutique, Julian stopped, his eyes fixed on a striking silver-gray suit in the window display. Caleb took his hand and led him inside. A sales associate greeted them with a smile. Caleb pointed to the suit Julian had been admiring and asked for it in his size. Julian was quiet as he took the suit and disappeared into the fitting room. Caleb leaned against a velvet sofa, his heart beating a fast, unsteady rhythm. Over the last few weeks, Julian had almost completely returned to his old self. He dyed his hair back to its natural black and removed the piercings. He was tall and slender, with pale skin that looked good in anything. Caleb could hardly imagine how stunning he would look in that suit. When the curtain to the fitting room was pulled aside, Caleb's breath caught in his throat. Julian stood there, his fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of the jacket. The suit was cut perfectly, accentuating his elegant frame. He looked like a work of art. He asked softly if it looked okay, his gaze not quite meeting Caleb's. Caleb stared, then slowly walked toward him, his voice low as he told him he was beautiful. A pleased blush colored Julian's cheeks. He turned to look in the mirror, but his smile faltered as his eyes landed on the faint scar on his collarbone. He instinctively raised a hand to cover it, his expression clouding over. He murmured that he didn't want to wear it, that he preferred something else. Caleb stepped up onto the platform behind him and gently took the hand covering the scar, moving it away. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss directly onto the mark. He told Julian, his voice earnest, that it didn't matter. He loved him, all of him, no matter what he looked like. Julian kept his head down, but tears began to well in his eyes. The text in Caleb's vision was a flurry of excitement. He felt a warmth spread through his chest. At that moment, Julian seemed to notice it too. He pointed a tentative finger toward the space just past Caleb's shoulder and asked what it was. Caleb looked at him, his heart seizing. He asked if Julian could see the text. Julian nodded. Caleb pulled him into a hug, a wave of triumphant relief washing over him. This was it. This was the final step. He helped Julian try on the suit again. It fit him like a second skin. Caleb's throat went dry. Julian, sensing his gaze, tugged at his sleeve, the tips of his ears turning pink. He asked if it didn't look good. Caleb assured him he looked perfect in everything. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet box he had been carrying for weeks. He dropped to one knee. He took Julian's hand, opening the box to reveal the ring inside. He told him he didn't just want to see him try on suits. He wanted Julian to wear them for him. Forever. He asked him to marry him. Julian gasped, taking a step back, his eyes wide with emotion. Caleb slipped the ring onto his finger. Through his tears, Julian whispered that he would. Caleb rose and pulled him into his arms, kissing him deeply as the store's staff burst into applause. He took his hand as they left the store, asking if he wanted to continue shopping. Julian shook his head and suggested dinner, mentioning a new steakhouse that had just opened on the top floor of the building. Caleb agreed, and they rode the elevator to the penthouse restaurant. As they stepped inside, Caleb's gaze fell on the man polishing glasses behind the bar. It was Liam Miller. He stopped, his body tensing. Julian, behind him, asked what was wrong. Caleb instinctively tried to block his view, but it was too late. Liam looked up, his eyes meeting theirs. His gaze went past Caleb and locked with Julian's. Julian froze, his expression turning vacant. Caleb tightened his grip on his hand, murmuring that they should go somewhere else. Julian shook his head numbly, his voice distant as he insisted they eat there. Resigned, Caleb led him to a table, requesting a private room from the hostess. Once they were seated, Caleb stepped outside and quietly told the server not to let the bartender approach their table. When he returned, Julian was staring at him with an unsettling intensity. He announced that he wanted a drink. When the server brought the menu, Julian waved it away. He wanted a freshly made cocktail, he said, his voice quiet but firm. He wanted the bartender from the front bar to come and make it for them. Caleb's hands began to tremble. He tried to persuade him to suggest a bottle of wine instead. Julian's voice rose, his eyes turning red-rimmed as he shouted that he could see the text, that he knew Liam was the one who was supposed to be the hero of the story. Caleb's heart sank. He tried to deny it, but Julian slammed his hand on the table, calling him a liar. At that moment, The door to their room opened, and Liam entered, pushing a small bar cart. He calmly asked what he could make for Julian. Julian gestured vaguely at the table, telling him to make anything. As Liam began to work with the shaker and ice, Julian stood up and circled him slowly. Caleb's nerves were stretched taut. In a flash, Julian snatched the sharp ice pick from the cart and lunged toward Liam. Caleb shouted and shot to his feet to intervene. Julian froze, his arm outstretched. Then, with a cry of despair, he reversed the direction of the blade, aiming it at his own heart. On pure instinct, Caleb threw his hand in front of the weapon. The sharp point plunged through his palm, the pain immediate and searing. Blood dripped from the blade, staining the white tablecloth below. The sight of Caleb's bloodied hand seemed to snap Julian out of his trance. He cried out Caleb's name, his face crumbling as he stared in horror. He backed away, babbling about why Caleb had stopped him, his eyes wild as he prepared to run headfirst into the wall. Liam moved with surprising speed, catching Julian and holding him in a strong embrace until his struggles subsided. Julian slumped against Liam, turning his tear-stained face toward Caleb. He told Liam that he seemed like a good person, and since they were the main characters, he could be at peace knowing Liam would take care of Caleb. Then he looked at Caleb, his eyes filled with self-loathing. He confessed that the moment he saw Liam, all he wanted to do was hurt him, and he didn't want to become that kind of evil person. Ignoring the throbbing pain in his hand, Caleb went to Julian and gathered him into his arms. He told him it would be all right, that they would leave this place, that he would take him abroad where they could start over. Julian just kept shaking his head. But then Liam spoke, his voice calm and clear. He told Julian that their lives had already changed. He looked at Caleb and said with quiet dignity that he would never fall in love with him. He was happy now, earning his own money to care for his mother. He was proud of the life he was building. As he gathered his tools, he added that he could see the text, too. And his said that a permanent bond might be the only thing that could truly sever the connection to the script. With that, he wheeled his cart out of the room. Julian was weeping, clutching Caleb's injured hand. Caleb stroked his hair, his own smile pained but gentle. It was over. Everything was finally over. In the hospital, Caleb's hand was stitched and bandaged. Julian sat beside him, carefully feeding him slices of apple, his expression soft with concern. Caleb watched his focused profile, a sweet warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fruit. He commented on how stable Julian had been lately. Julian paused, his eyes clear and bright. He agreed, noting that it seemed to be fine as long as he didn't see Liam. He added that he thought Liam was a good person, and that Ryan had even stopped by earlier with a fruit basket from him, wishing Caleb a speedy recovery. Caleb smiled, his fingers tracing the engagement ring on Julian's hand. He remarked that Julian should listen to him then. Julian looked puzzled, asking what he meant. Caleb leaned in close, his voice a low whisper in his ear. To let him mark him permanently. Julian flushed, pushing away playfully and tapping him on the chest. He insisted they had to wait until after the wedding. Caleb laughed, catching his hand and agreeing, his heart full of anticipation. 2 months later, the wedding was a grand affair. The church was filled with the scent of white gardenias, and every seat was taken by friends and family. Julian, in his custom silver-gray suit, walked down the aisle toward him, his smile pure and radiant. When they exchanged rings, both their hands were trembling. The moment Julian spoke his vows, Caleb pulled him into his arms, kissing him before all their witnesses as they began their own life, their own story. It was late by the time they sent the last guest home. Caleb, heady from champagne and happiness, collapsed against Julian the moment they stepped into their hotel suite. His pheromones, no longer restrained, filled the air, a wave of cool mint that eagerly sought out its mate. Julian, no longer resisting, released his own sweet gardenia scent to meet it. Caleb looked down at his husband, his gaze intense. They were married. Julian's voice was husky as he confirmed it. Caleb pulled off his tie and leaned down to kiss him, a fusion of breath and love. He found Julian's scent gland, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin as he completed the permanent bond. When it was done, Julian was pliant and soft in his arms. Caleb held him close, asking if they would be together forever. Julian, his voice thick with emotion, promised that they would. On the day they returned from their honeymoon, Julian turned to him with a serious expression. He wanted to see Liam. Caleb hesitated, the memory of the steakhouse still vivid and terrifying. Julian took his hand, his gaze steady. He knew what Caleb was worried about, but he touched the mark on his neck, the permanent proof of their bond. He said the holographic text was gone, that they were no longer puppets. They were real people now. His words soothed Caleb's lingering fears, and after a moment, he agreed. The next day, he had his assistant arrange a meeting. When they walked into the restaurant, they saw a familiar figure sitting at a table with Liam. It was Ryan Vance. He was pouring Liam a glass of water, the gesture casual and intimate. Caleb and Julian both stopped, completely bewildered. Liam and Ryan stood to greet them, both looking relaxed and happy. Ryan grinned, greeting them as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Julian started to ask, but trailed off, unsure what to say. Ryan simply slung an arm around Liam's shoulders and announced that, as they could see, they were together now. Caleb recovered first, a slow smile spreading across his face as he congratulated them. He led Julian to the table and they ordered drinks. Throughout the meal, Julian was his old self, witty, engaged, and completely at ease. Caleb finally truly relaxed. He raised his glass for a toast. For glasses clinked together, the sound clear and bright. Without the script, without the text, they had all become the protagonists of their own lives, each finding their own happy ending.